I've told this story maybe 4 times in my life, twice to people who didn't believe me, once to a woman I loved who left anyway, and now to you. I'm going to tell it right this time, slow, the way it actually happened, not the way the recruiters like to spin it. My name doesn't matter much, but if you need something to hold on to, call me Corin. I was 26 standard years old when I signed up for the outward contracts, and I was one of maybe 9,000 humans on the whole muster list who'd never fired a weapon in real anger. I lied about that on my forms. Everybody did. See, the galaxy has this idea about us, about humans. They think we're born wolves. They think every one of us came out of the womb already knowing how to bleed for a cause. It isn't true. Most of us were just poor and cold and tired of a home world that had run out of room. But the dominions out there, the big old alien powers with their spires and their dead moons and their languages that sound like wind through broken glass, they believe it. And when a whole galaxy believes a thing about you, sometimes you start living inside their belief. You become the story they tell. That's how I ended up on Threnwareth. That's how I ended up standing in the Pale Hall on the day the Queen stopped breathing. Let me set it for you properly. Threnwareth is not a warm world. I want you to understand that first, because everything that happened there happened in the cold. The sky is the color of old iron most days, low and heavy, like a lid pressed down on a pot. There's a sun somewhere behind it, a small white one, but you rarely see it whole. You just get this thin gray light that never quite becomes day and never quite becomes night. The locals have a word for it. Vesh. It means the in-between hour. Except on Areth, the in-between hour lasts your entire life. The city was called Sareth Vale. It sat on a plateau above a frozen sea, and the whole thing was built vertical, spires stacked on spires, towers threaded through with these long glass tubes they used for transit. So at night you'd see little lights sliding up and down inside the buildings like blood moving through veins. The gravity lifts hummed all the time. A low sound under everything that you stopped hearing after about a week and then heard forever after you left. I still hear it sometimes, in quiet rooms, that hum. The Thren themselves, the people, they're tall. Taller than us by a head, most of them, with long limbs and this pale bluish skin that goes almost translucent at the wrists and throat, so you can see the darker veins underneath. Their eyes are large and dark and wet-looking, no white to them at all, just this deep liquid black. When they're calm, they blink slow, like something at the bottom of the ocean. When they're afraid, they don't blink at all. I mention the blinking because it matters later. Remember it. They hired human guards for the inner court because of an old superstition, mostly. The Thren believe that a body cannot lie the way a mouth can. And they decided somewhere in their long history that human bodies were especially bad liars, that we sweat and flinch and stand a certain way when we mean harm, and that a trained Thren courtier could read us like weather. So they surrounded their most precious people with us, not because we were the strongest, because we were, to them, the most honest, which is funny, given every one of us had lied to get there. There were 40 of us in the Queen's household detachment, real soldiers, most of them, pulled from a dozen human contracts, and then there was our commander, Sergeant Deyan Roshar. I need to talk about Deyan for a while, because this whole story is really about him, even though it's the Queen everyone remembers. He was older than the rest of us, late 40s maybe. Gray coming in hard at his temples, a face like something carved out of dark wood and then left out in the rain for a decade. Broad through the shoulders in a way that made the Thren courtiers step aside without deciding to. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was quiet and you leaned in and you did what he said. He had this stillness about him. Some men are still because they're empty. Deyan was still the way a loaded thing is still. Nobody knew where he came from. That wasn't unusual. Half the outward contractors were running from something, and you learned early not to ask. But with Deyan it was different. It wasn't that he wouldn't tell you. It was that he genuinely didn't seem to know. He told me once, over a cold ration and colder coffee on a night watch, that his memory started when he woke up in a medbay on a transit station out past the Carvish Reach 11 years before. Broken, half his body rebuilt with alloy and gel. No papers, no name he could remember. A doctor asked him what to write down, and he looked out the window at a blue star and said, Deyan. Just the first sound that came. Roshar was the name of the station. So you don't know your real name, I said. No. Or where you were born. No. Doesn't that? I didn't finish it. It felt rude. He finished it for me. Bother me. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. Big hands, scarred across the knuckles. It used to. You spend a lot of years reaching back for a wall in the dark. Then one day you stop reaching. What's behind me doesn't feed me. What's in front of me does. He drank. That's the whole trick of staying sane out here, kid. Don't reach back. I thought that was the wisest thing anyone had ever said to me. I was 26. I thought a lot of things. Anyway, that was Deyan. That was the man who walked into the pale hall. The queen was called Ysare. I'd been on the detachment 8 months before I ever saw her up close, and even then it was from the edge of a room, standing at attention with my eyes forward like we were trained. But you couldn't not look at her a little. Everyone did. She was, I want to find the right word, not beautiful the way a human woman is beautiful. It was something else. She was composed. Every part of her arranged like it had been placed there on purpose and would never move again without her permission. She wore these long pale robes, gray and silver, that seemed to have weather in them somehow, like fog given a shape. Her skin was that deep vein blue, and her eyes were the wettest, darkest of any Thren I ever saw, and she moved through the court like the court was water, and she was the only thing that knew how to stand. They said she'd ruled for 60 of their years, which is a long time even for them. They said she'd held the Dominion together through 2 famines and a border war, and the ash winter that killed 1/10 of the population on the outer moons. They said she had never once, in public, shown fear. And they said this in whispers, this only when the older Thren thought no humans were near enough to hear, that she had loved exactly one person in her long life, and that she had lost him, and that a piece of her had gone into the ground with him and never come back up. His name was Consort Lanwith, but everyone just called him the Consort, or, more softly, the one who is gone. Here's what I pieced together over my time there, from courtiers and cleaners, and one very old librarian who liked our human liquor. Kale had not been born royal. That was the scandal of it 60 years back. He'd been a soldier, a border warden out on the frozen edges, low-blooded, common. There'd been an attack on the young queen's convoy when she was newly crowned and barely more than a girl by their reckoning, and Kale had been the officer who threw himself between her and a plasma lance and lived, somehow, when he should not have. Half his body burned to the alloy underneath. And she'd sat with him through the healing, this young queen, day after day, against every advisor's counsel, and by the time he could walk again she had decided, with that same total, immovable certainty she decided everything, that she would marry him or no one. She married him. And for 30 of their years, by every account, they were the still center of that cold world. The soldier and the queen. He never learned to like the court. He stood at her shoulder at every ceremony looking like he'd rather be anywhere with a wall to guard. But when she spoke, he watched her the way you watch a fire you built yourself. Then he died. The stories got vague there. A patrol beyond the outer moons. A ship that didn't come back. No body recovered. The cold and the dark out past the reach don't give bodies back. There was a monument, but there was no grave. And the queen, they said, had gone into the pale hall on the day the fleet confirmed the loss, and had stood there alone for a full day and a night, and had come out with her face arranged exactly the way it always was, composed, immovable, and had never once spoken his name in public again. That was the woman, that was the loss. 22 of their years old, that loss, by the time I arrived. Old enough that it had stopped being a wound and become a fact. a weather pattern, the permanent vesh of her. Now you know everything I knew that morning when Deyan walked in. It was a reception day. That's the closest word we had for it. A few times a year the Queen held open court in the Pale Hall, the great white chamber at the top of the central spire, all pale stone and pale light, with the long glass transit tubes running up the outer walls so you could see the little lights of the city sliding past far below. Petitioners came, envoys from the outer moons, merchant houses, sometimes off-world delegations if the year was tense enough to need them soothed. Our job on reception days was simple and boring. Stand along the walls, watch the crowd, look human and honest and dangerous. Most of us hated it, hours of stillness, the cold seeping up through the stone floor into your boots, the low hum of the lifts under everything. Deyan usually took the position nearest the dais, closest to the Queen. It was the post of most trust, and the Thren had granted it to him without any of us quite understanding why. He'd never done anything to earn it that we saw. He just stood there like he'd been carved to fit the spot. That morning, something was off with the rotation. One of ours, a big Kettering contract soldier named Voss, had gone down with fever the night before, and the schedule got shuffled, and Deyan ended up entering the hall late, after the Queen was already seated and the first petitioners were already being announced. I remember the exact moment. I was posted along the east wall, maybe 40 feet from the dais, and I had a clear line to the whole thing. The great doors at the far end opened. Deyan came in. He was in the gray household dress, the formal one, with the long coat and the ceremonial gorget at the throat. He'd shaved. His gray-shot hair was pushed back. He walked the length of the hall the way he walked everywhere, unhurried, planting each foot like the floor owed him nothing, heading for his post at the foot of the dais. And the Queen saw him. I was watching her face. I don't know why. Some instinct. And I watched it happen in real time, and I have never in my life seen anything like it before or since. She stopped blinking. You have to understand what that meant. I told you, remember it, I said. A calm Thren blinks slow. A frightened one doesn't blink at all. And Queen Ysare, who had ruled 60 years and buried a war and never once shown a public flicker of fear, went completely, absolutely still. Her large, dark eyes fixed on the man crossing her floor. Her hands, folded in her lap, opened very slowly, the long fingers spreading against the pale silver of her robes like she was trying to hold onto something that wasn't there. The petitioner in front of her kept talking, some grain tax matter. The words just kept coming and coming into a hall that had, without anyone announcing it, stopped listening. Because the courtiers were starting to notice her face too, and a stillness was spreading out from the dais like cold spreads across water, and the petitioner faltered and stopped, and looked over his shoulder to see what everyone else was seeing. Deyan had stopped walking. He was maybe 15 feet from the dais. He'd felt it the way you feel a room turn, and he'd stopped, and he was looking up at her now with an expression I'd never seen on him. Not alarm, not confusion, something slower than that, like a man hearing a song from very far away that he thinks but isn't sure he might once have known. Nobody moved. I swear the lift hum got louder in that silence. I swear you could hear the little transit light sliding up and down the glass tubes on the walls. The Queen stood up. You didn't do that. There were protocols. The Queen did not rise for anyone. The hall rose for her. Her chief steward, an ancient Thren named Olivar with silver at his throat and 40 years of court behind him, actually took half a step toward her, his mouth opening to, I don't know, to remind her to catch her, and she lifted one hand, not even looking at him, and he froze where he stood. She came down off the dais. 3 steps. She took them one at a time, that long fog-colored robe pooling and dragging behind her, her dark eyes never once leaving Deyan's face. And Deyan, I watched this. Deyan straightened, the way we're trained to for the Queen, chin up, eyes forward, the whole thing automatic. But his hands, I could see his hands at his sides. They weren't steady. This man whose hands never moved. They were open and they weren't steady. She stopped in front of him. She was taller than him, she was taller than all of us, and she looked down into his face, and for a long, long moment she just searched it. Her gaze went across his brow, his cheekbones, the line of his jaw, the scar at the corner of his mouth, reading him the way the Thren read a body. And then she said one word. It wasn't in the trade tongue we all spoke. It was Old Thren, the deep court language, and I didn't understand it then. I asked Olivar later what it meant, and the old steward looked at me for a while before he answered, and when he answered his voice wasn't steady either. The word was a name. Kale. She said it very quietly, almost like a question, almost like she already knew the answer and was afraid of it. Deyan didn't move. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, standing 40 feet away with my back to a cold wall. I felt the floor of the world tip a little, because I knew Deyan's story. I knew he'd woken up 11 years ago in a medbay past the Karvish Reach, broken and rebuilt, half his body burned down to the alloy underneath, with no name and no past and a blue star out the window. And I was doing the arithmetic. 11 years since Deyan woke, 22 since the consort was lost. The numbers didn't match, I want you to know that. I held on to that in the moment like a railing. The numbers don't match, it's a coincidence. Every galaxy has faces that repeat. It's just a face. But I was looking at his hands. Deyan spoke, his voice was rough. Your Majesty, he said in the trade tongue, the words we were trained to say. Are you unwell? And something crossed her face when he spoke, a flinch, small, but I saw it, because whatever she'd heard in her memory, it hadn't been that voice. Or maybe it had been close enough to that voice to hurt and not close enough to be certain. Her hand, the one that had spread open against her robes, lifted now slowly and reached toward his face. Olivar made a sound, a warning sound. There were envoys in the room. There were merchant houses. Whatever was happening on that floor, it was happening in public, in front of the whole cold machinery of the court. And a queen who reached out to touch a human guard in open hall was a queen who could be questioned, and on Oreth, a queen who could be questioned did not always stay a queen. She stopped her hand an inch from his cheek. I watched her stop it. I watched the 60 years of iron come back down over her, piece by piece like armor. I watched her decide in real time in front of all of us that whatever this was, she could not have it here. Not like this. Not with the whole Dominion watching to see if their queen's spine had finally cracked. She lowered her hand. Forgive me, she said, and her voice was steady again, and it was the most terrible steady thing I ever heard because you could feel what it cost. The light. I mistook you for a pause, barely a breath, someone I knew. And she turned and walked back up the 3 steps and sat down on the dais, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked out at the hall with her composed, immovable face and said, The petitioner may continue. The grain tax man stared at her. Continue, she said again. And he continued. God help him, he continued, something about outer moon quotas. And the court unfroze slowly, and the courtiers arranged their faces, and the whole vast cold machine of the reception ground back into motion. And up on the dais, the Queen of Threnoreth sat perfectly still and did not blink. Deyan took his post at the foot of the dais. He stood there the rest of the reception, 4 more hours, petitioner after petitioner, and he never once moved, never once looked up at her, planted like always. But I was watching him, I couldn't stop, and I saw that his jaw was tight, and that a muscle in it worked once, twice, and that the whole time, the whole 4 hours, one of his big scarred hands stayed pressed flat against his own thigh, holding still, the way you hold your own hand still when it wants to reach for something. They wouldn't have let it be, of course, the court. You don't do what she did, rise from the dais, come down onto the floor, say a dead man's name to a foreign hireling in open hall, and have the court simply forget it. By nightfall, the whole spire was a low murmur of it. In the guard barracks it was worse. Somebody had heard the name. Somebody knew the story. And a theory went around, ugly and fast the way barracks theories do, that the human sergeant was a plant, a long game. Somebody's agent, sent in with a rebuilt face, a stolen face, made to look like the dead consort so he could crack the queen open from the inside. That he'd worked his way to the post nearest the throne on purpose. That the whole thing today was the trap springing. I heard 3 men say it before I stopped listening. It made a kind of sense if you didn't know Deyan. That was the thing about it. It made sense. But I knew Deyan. I'd sat with him on cold night watches. I'd watched him carry a wounded Ketran 2 miles through a Vesh storm because leaving him wasn't a thing he could do. I'd watched him give his own rations to a sick recruit and lie about not being hungry. There was no long game in that man. If he was an agent, he was the worst agent in the history of the practice, because he'd spent 11 years being nothing but exactly, painfully, who he was. I went to find him. He was on the observation gallery, high up on the outer face of the spire, where the glass ran floor to ceiling and you could see the whole frozen sea below, silver-gray under the low iron sky. He was alone, just standing there with his hands on the rail, looking out at nothing. "Sergeant," I said. He didn't turn. "You hear what they're saying downstairs?" "Yeah." "You believe it?" "No." He was quiet a moment. The lift hum came up faint through the floor. "Smart of you," he said, "'cause I don't know what I believe and I'm the one it's about." I came and stood beside him at the rail. Below us the transit lights slid up and down the tubes of the lower city, little blood cells of light. Far out, the frozen sea threw back that thin gray glow. "She called you a name," I said. "I heard it." "You know what it means?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. "When I woke up," he said finally, 11 years ago, in that medbay, half of me was gone, burned off, they said, down to the alloy. They rebuilt what they could." He lifted one hand off the rail and turned it over, looking at the scars across the knuckles like they belonged to someone else. "The doctor there, old Ketran woman, kind as anything, she told me I'd been found in a wreck, a drifter, way out past the reach, dead cold, no beacon. She said by all the numbers I should have been dead a long time before they cut me out of it. Years, maybe. She couldn't explain it. The cold, she said. The cold out there does things. Slows a body down past where a body's meant to slow." He set the hand back on the rail. "I never thought much about it. You don't when you're trying to learn to walk again. You just do the next thing." I felt the floor of the world tipping again. Years, maybe. The numbers I'd been holding onto like a railing were coming loose in my hands. "Sergeant," I said carefully, "how long were you out there before they found you?" "Nobody knows," he said. "That's the thing, nobody could say." He looked out at the frozen sea. "Could have been months, could have been longer. The cold," he stopped, started again. "The cold doesn't keep a calendar." Neither of us said the number out loud. The gap. The 11 and the 22 and the years. Maybe that sat in the middle of them like a bridge nobody wanted to be the first to step on. "You remember anything?" I asked, quiet. "Anything at all from before?" And this is the part I've never been able to shake. This is the part I still see, in quiet rooms, with the lift hum in my ears. He didn't say no. He'd always said no. Every time for 11 years when anyone asked no, nothing, my memory starts in the medbay, don't reach back. That was his whole religion. Don't reach back. But this time he didn't say no. He said cold, very quietly. I remember cold, and I remember his jaw worked. There's a thing I've had, long as I can remember, which is only 11 years, so maybe it's nothing. A picture in my head when I'm falling asleep. Gray robes. Somebody in gray robes standing with their back to me at a window looking out at snow. And I always thought it was a dream, just a dream I keep having. He turned from the rail and looked at me, and his eyes, this stone-carved man's eyes, were wet. But I saw those robes today. Corin. I saw those exact robes today walking down off a throne toward me. And I don't, his voice cracked, finally, all the way, this man who never cracked. I don't know what I am. I didn't have anything to say to that. There wasn't anything. I put my hand on his shoulder and he let me, and we stood there at the glass with the whole frozen world below us, and neither of us said the thing we were both thinking, which was, what if? She sent for him that night. Not through the court, not through Olivar and the machinery, through a single quiet servant, an old Thren woman who'd been with the queen for 50 years and whose loyalty was to the woman and not the crown. She came to the barracks after the third watch, cloaked, and asked for the human sergeant by his post number, and said the queen would receive him in the pale hall, alone, and that no record would be made. He looked at me before he went, just looked at me. I don't know what he wanted, permission maybe, or a witness in case. Go, I said. You'll never sleep again if you don't. He went. I didn't see it. I want to be clear about that, because I've heard other versions of this story since, told by people who claim they were there, and they're lying. Nobody was there. Just the two of them in the great pale empty hall, at the dead center of the Vesh hour, with the lift humming under the stone and the transit lights sliding past in the dark. But he told me, after, once, and I'll give it to you the way he gave it to me and you can decide what it was. He said she was standing when he came in, not on the dais, down on the floor at the tall window with her back to the door, looking out at the frozen sea. Gray robes, exactly the picture from his falling asleep dream, he said, exactly it. He stood in the doorway and couldn't make his feet move. She said without turning, "Come closer. I will not have you at the far end of a room like a stranger." He came closer. She turned around. And she looked at him again the way she had in the hall, that slow, terrible searching red across every part of his face. And then she said, in the trade tongue this time so he'd understand, "They tell me you are a hireling from a poor world, that you have no past, that your memory begins 11 years ago in a bed on a station past the reach." Her voice was very level. "Is this true?" "Yes, Majesty." "They also tell me," she said, "that I have humiliated myself, that I am an old woman who saw a face in a crowd and lost her reason. My steward has begged me all afternoon to have you sent off-world quietly, so that the court forgets by winter." A pause. "Do you think I should do that?" He didn't answer, he didn't know how. She crossed the space between them, slowly. And this time there was no court, no envoys, no machinery, no reason in the whole cold world to stop her hand, so she didn't stop it. She laid her palm against his cheek. And he said he told me this looking at the floor, in a voice I'd never heard from him. He said that the moment her hand touched his face, he felt something in his chest that had no name, a thing that was grief and homecoming at once, a door opening in a house he didn't remember owning. He said his eyes filled up before his mind understood why. He said his own hand came up and covered hers against his cheek before he decided to move it. And he said the two of them stood there like that, in the middle of the empty hall, a broken human soldier and the queen of a dead cold world, holding a stranger's face like it was the last warm thing in the galaxy. "I don't know if I'm him," he said to her, his voice wrecked. "I want to tell you I'm him. I've got nothing in me to prove it. Just cold and a dream about your robes and a face I didn't choose. I could be anybody. I could be a lie somebody built to hurt you. You should send me away, Majesty. You should send me away and never." "Be quiet," she said. And she said he told me this last, and then he never spoke of any of it again, not once, for as long as I knew him, she said. Calanweth threw himself in front of a lance for me when he was young and I was younger, and lost half his body to the fire, and lay in a bed for a year while I learned the shape of his face by heart. I have not forgotten one line of it in 60 years. I have carried it against the dark like a coal in two cupped hands. I would know it burned. I would know it rebuilt. I would know it if you were made of alloy and grief and nothing else. Her thumb moved once across the scar at the corner of his mouth. "I do not need you to prove you are him. I need you to stop telling me you are not. Here's what happened after. Because you'll want to know, and I owe you the truth, even the parts that aren't clean. There was no fairy tale ending. I want to say that plainly, because the recruiters and the storytellers have gotten hold of this thing over the years and sanded it into something it wasn't. They didn't stand up in front of the court the next morning and announce a resurrection. The Dominion of Threnhoreth is a cold machine, and it does not run on love stories, and a queen who declared that her dead common-born consort had come back in a hireling's rebuilt body would not have kept her throne to the next Veshturn. She knew that. She'd always known exactly what the world would and wouldn't allow her. It was how she'd survived 60 years. So it stayed quiet. He kept his post. Sergeant Deyan Roshar, human contractor, foot of the dais, position of most trust. The court decided because the court needed to decide something that the Queen's moment in the hall had been a passing frailty, an old grief stirred by a chance resemblance, and that it had passed, and that the matter was closed. Olivar made sure the story hardened that way. He was a good steward. He protected her the only way the world let him. But I knew. I knew because of the small things. The way, on reception days, she never once looked down at the guard at the foot of her dais. Never, not a flicker, so total in her not looking that it could only have been a discipline. The way that once a season, on the quiet nights, an old cloaked servant would come to the barracks after the third watch. The way Deyan, who taught me that the whole trick of staying sane out there was don't reach back, stopped saying it. Just stopped. The way I caught him once, standing at the glass on the observation gallery, looking out at the snow, and there was a stillness on his face that wasn't the loaded, waiting stillness I'd known. It was a settled thing, a man at rest in a place he'd finally stopped fighting. They had, I think, 4 of their years, stolen ones, in an empty hall at the dead center of the Vesh hour where no record was made. Then the border trouble came back on the outer moons, the way it always did, and the detachment got rotated, and my contract came up, and I took a berth off-world because I was young and there were stars I hadn't seen. I said goodbye to him on the landing platform in the gray iron light. He gripped my hand. He didn't say much. He never said much. The last thing he said to me was, "You did right that night on the gallery, telling me to go." "I know," I said. He almost smiled. "Cocky," he said, and that was the last time I saw him. I heard years later that the Queen died. 68 of their years on the throne in the end. They said she went in her sleep in the winter, and that the whole cold world mourned her the way you mourn a mountain, not with weeping but with a kind of stunned silence, because you never really believed the mountain could go. And I heard this from a Ketran trader in a bar 4 systems away, who'd served a season on Oreth and didn't know he was telling me anything that mattered. That on the day the Queen of Threnhoreth was laid in the ground, a single human contractor, an old gray sergeant from the household detachment, had requested release from his contract that same morning. No reason given. And that he'd walked out of the spire alone into the Vesh, out toward the frozen sea, in the failing light. And that nobody had seen him come back. The trader thought it was a sad little footnote, an old soldier who couldn't take the cold anymore. He shrugged when he told it. He didn't understand why I put my drink down and went quiet and had to go outside for a while. Because I understood it, I understood exactly. He'd spent 11 years, no, 30 years, 60, however long the cold had really held him reaching back for a wall in the dark, and he'd found it. He'd found the one hand in the whole galaxy that knew the shape of his burned and rebuilt face by heart, and he'd held it in secret in an empty hall for 4 stolen years. And when it was gone, he did the only thing that made any sense to a man like that. He went back out into the cold that had kept him once before, to see if it would keep him again, to see if it would carry him wherever it had carried the rest of what he was, out past the reach, past the calendar, past the reach of anyone's numbers, to a window with gray robes and someone standing with their back to him, looking out at the snow. I don't know if he found it. I want to tell you he did. I've got nothing in me to prove it. Just cold and a dream about gray robes that isn't even mine, and a face I saw freeze on a throne one gray morning a long way from here. But I know what I saw in the pale hall that day. I saw a woman who'd never shown fear stop breathing at the sight of a man crossing her floor. I saw 60 years of iron come off her face for the length of one word. And I saw a man who couldn't remember his own name lift his hand to hold a stranger's palm against his cheek like it was the last warm thing in the whole cold galaxy, and weep without knowing why. The mouth can lie. That's what the Thren always said. That's why they hired us. They thought our bodies couldn't. 2 bodies met in that hall, and neither of them lied. Whatever else I don't know, I know that. And some nights in quiet rooms, when the heating hums low under the floor, and it sounds just enough like a gravity lift far away, I hope the cold was kind. I hope it slowed him down past where a body's meant to slow. I hope it carried him all the way back to that window. I hope, wherever the 2 of them are, it isn't cold there anymore. I told you it stayed quiet. That was true, but I skipped something, and I skipped it on purpose because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of and the part I'm most afraid of. I told you they had 4 stolen years. I made it sound gentle. Old servant in a cloak, quiet nights, a settled look on his face at the glass. It didn't get gentle for free. There was a night in the middle of it, maybe a year after she laid her palm against his cheek in the empty hall, when the whole thing nearly ended in blood on the pale stone. And I was there for that one. I saw all of it. So let me back up and tell you the piece I was too much of a coward to start with. You have to understand how the court took it underneath. On the surface, like I said, they'd hardened the story. Passing frailty, old grief, chance resemblance, matter closed. That was the official shape of it. But a court like that one doesn't run on the official shape of things. It runs on what people actually believe in the dark of their own skulls, and what a lot of them actually believed was uglier and, in its way, more dangerous than the truth. There was a man, Warden General Sithrin Vor. I need to describe him, because he's the other half of what happened, and if you only picture the Queen and the guard, you'll miss it. Vor was old-blooded, high Thren, the kind whose family had held plateau cities before Ysare's line ever wore the pale robes. Tall even for them, taller than Deyan by 2 heads, with that translucent bluish skin gone thin and papery with age at the throat, so you could see the dark veins moving whenever he swallowed. He commanded the Ashguard, the Queen's own elite, the household soldiers, real Thren warriors in dark segmented armor that drank the light instead of throwing it back. They were the best fighters on the plateau. They'd been raised to it from childhood. And they did not love the fact that a huddle of human hirelings stood closest to the throne. Vor especially did not love it. I learned later from Olivar, years on, when the old steward was dying and wanted somebody to hear the whole thing before he went, that Vor's grudge was older than any of us. He'd been a young officer 60 years back, high-blooded, favored, one of the men everyone assumed the young queen would raise up beside her. And then a common border warden had thrown himself in front of a lance and taken half his body to the fire, and the queen had chosen that. A low blood, a nothing from the frozen edges. Vor had watched a soldier with no name and no line take the place he'd been promised by his own blood, and he had smiled at the wedding, and he had waited 60 years, and he had never once forgotten it. So when a human hireling walked into the pale hall wearing the dead consort's face, and the queen came down off her throne for him in front of the whole dominion, Vor didn't see a love story. He saw an opening. He didn't believe Deyan was Kale come back. Vor didn't have the kind of soul that could believe a thing like that. What he believed, or what he decided to act as if he believed, which for a man like Vor is the same thing, was that the human was a weapon, a plant. Some off-world power had taken the consort's face out of the old records, grown it onto a broken soldier, and slipped him in beside the throne to break the queen open and hollow out the dominion from the inside, and that the queen in her grief was too compromised to see it, which meant she was unfit, which meant the court needed a steadier hand, a regency, say, a council, led naturally by someone old-blooded and loyal and patient. You see how clean it is. He didn't even have to lie, really. He just had to take the thing that was actually happening, a queen falling for a face, and give it the worst possible name. And it fit. That was the horror of it. It fit better than the truth did. He spent a year building it, quietly. A word here, a doubt there, dropped into the right ancient ears. By the time he moved, half the high-blooded houses on the plateau were ready to believe that their queen had been captured by a foreign puppet, and that a loyal warden general was the only thing standing between the Dominion and ruin. And then he moved, on a reception day, in open hall, with the whole court watching the way he did everything, because Vor understood, the way Ysare understood, that on Areth the only power that's real is the power other people can see. I felt it before I understood it. I was on the east wall again, same as always, 40 feet from the dais, eyes forward. It was a big reception, envoys from 2 of the outer moons, 3 merchant houses, the hall packed and cold, the lift hum coming up through the stone into my boots. Deyan at the foot of the dais, planted, still. The queen above him on her throne, composed, immovable, doing the thing she disciplined herself into for a year, never once looking down at the guard below her. So total in her not looking that it was its own kind of touch. The Ashguard came in. That was the first wrong thing. The Ashguard didn't attend open receptions. That was our job, the human household. The Ashguard held the outer spire, the approaches, the walls. But a full file of them came in through the great doors, dark armor drinking the pale light, and took up positions along both walls. And something in the room's temperature dropped that had nothing to do with the cold. I saw Deyan's shoulders change, just slightly, a man reading weather. Vor walked the length of the hall. He didn't ask to be announced. He came up the center of the floor, tall and papery and slow, and he stopped in exactly the spot where the queen had come down off her throne a year before. I don't think that was an accident. I don't think one thing that man did was ever an accident. And he made his obeisance, the deep old blood bow, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of that pale stone room, "Majesty, I come before the court on a matter of the Dominion's safety, and I ask that it be heard in open hall, so that no one may later say it was decided in shadow." Olivar at the queen's shoulder went rigid. He knew. Old stewards always know a half-second before anyone else. The queen said, "Speak, Warden General." And Vor turned not to her, to Deyan. "That human," he said, "wears the face of your late consort." The hall went silent, even the lift hum seemed to drop. "I have made study of it this year past," Vor went on, unhurried, reasonable, terrible in his reasonableness. "I have compared the records. The likeness is not chance, Majesty. It is manufactured. No world grows 2 faces so alike by accident. This creature was built. Grown in some off-world vat from the images in our own archives, and sent here, into the heart of your household, to the post nearest your person, a post. And here he let it hang, that he sought and gained with suspicious ease. He was made to look like the one being in the galaxy whose face could make you set down your reason. And it worked, Majesty. Before this entire court a year ago it worked. You came down off your throne for him. He let that land. He let the whole room remember it. I do not blame you," Vor said, softer now, the false gentleness worse than the accusation. "Grief is not a crime, but grief has been used against you, against all of us, and the hand that used it is standing at the foot of your throne with a weapon at his belt. I ask the court's leave to take him, to question him, and I ask that until the Dominion's safety is assured, the Queen's judgment in this matter be supported by a council of the old houses." He bowed again. "For your protection, Majesty, only that." There it was, the whole year of quiet work springing shut. Take the human, prove he's a plant or make it look proven, declare the Queen compromised, support her judgment, a council, a regency, a crown with old-blooded hands around its throat. And I want you to understand the trap of it, the real trap, the one that made my stomach drop as I stood there against the cold wall. There was no good answer. If the Queen defended Deyan, if she said no, He's not a plant. Leave him. She'd be doing exactly what a captured, compromised queen would do. She'd be proving Vor's point with her own mouth. Every word she spoke to save him would be another stone in the wall Vor was building around her throne. And if she gave him up, if she let the Ashguard take him to be questioned, which on Areth meant a cold room and things done to a body until it stopped, she'd be sending the man she'd waited 60 years for to his death to keep her crown. Vor had built her a door with a grave behind each side of it. I looked at her face. I couldn't help it. Everyone in that hall was looking at her face, waiting to see the iron crack. It didn't crack. But I saw from 40 feet, I saw her hands close, slowly, on the arms of the throne, the long fingers curling down against the pale stone. The way they'd opened a year ago, reaching for something that wasn't there. Now they closed on nothing, on the throne. She was going to have to choose, and there was no version of the choice that didn't cost her everything. She opened her mouth. And Deyan spoke first. He wasn't allowed to, that's the thing. A household guard did not speak in open hall ever for any reason. It was the one law of our post more absolute than the cold. You stood, you watched. You were an honest body against the wall and nothing more. To speak was to be gone from the detachment by nightfall. He spoke anyway. He's right, Deyan said. The word cut across the whole packed hall. Rough, plain, a human voice in a room built for the wind-through-glass court tongue. Every head turned. The queen's fingers went still on the stone. He's right that I've got no proof, Deyan said. He wasn't looking at Vor. He was looking up at her, straight up at her on the throne, the first time in a year I'd seen him let himself do it, and his voice was steady in a way I'd never heard it. I don't know what I am. I've told her that. I've got a burned body somebody rebuilt and a name I picked off a station wall and no past at all before 11 years ago. Maybe I was grown in a vat. Maybe I'm exactly what he says. I can't stand here and swear to you that I'm not because I don't know, and I won't lie to you, not ever. His jaw worked. So take me, Warden General, question me. I'll go easy. I won't make your soldiers work for it. Vor almost smiled. I saw it start. But Deyan said, before you do one thing. He turned, away from the throne, toward the great doors at the far end of the hall, the ones the Ashguard had come through, toward the packed crowd of envoys and merchant houses standing in the center of the floor. And he said, very quietly, in a voice that no longer sounded steady at all, that sounded, for the first time, alarmed. Nobody's watching the East Envoy. I didn't understand. Nobody understood. Vor's mouth curled, a diversion, he thought, a coward's trick, the puppet buying seconds. And then the East Envoy moved. I have gone over this 1,000 times, in quiet rooms with the lift hum in my ears. I've tried to work out how Deyan saw it, and none of the rest of us did. 40 trained humans, a file of Ashguard, a warden general who'd been watching that hall his whole life. How the one man being publicly accused of being a threat was the only one in the room who'd clocked the actual one. I've only got one answer, and I don't like how it sounds, but I'll give it to you. He'd stood at the foot of that throne for 2 years, watching, being an honest body. He knew that room the way a man knows the inside of his own chest. And somewhere in him, in the burned, rebuilt body that may be remembered, 60 years back, what it was to throw itself in front of a lance for the girl on the throne, something had never once stopped standing guard, even while the whole court argued about whether he was a lie. The East Envoy was from one of the outer moons. Gray robes, not the Queen's silver, a duller gray, the delegation gray. He'd been standing quiet in the crowd the whole reception. Nobody's eyes on him because everybody's eyes were on the Warden General and the human and the Queen. The perfect blind. The whole confrontation, I understood later, much later, had been cover. Not Vor's cover, somebody else's. Somebody who'd known that on this day, at this reception, the entire court's attention would be nailed to the center of the floor by a spectacle, leaving one gray-robed figure entirely unwatched at the edge of it. Vor wanted a regency. The thing in the gray robes wanted the queen dead. I don't know to this day if they were connected. I've never known. Maybe Vor's plot had a partner he didn't fully control. Maybe it was pure chance, two knives arriving on the same day. The court never settled it because the man in the gray robes never answered any questions. He came out of the crowd fast, fast, which is faster than us, those long limbs, and there was something in his hand that wasn't allowed in the hall, a short black lance rod, court-forbidden moon-made, the kind of thing that punches a hole clean through pale stone. And he wasn't going for Vor. He wasn't going for a merchant. He was going for the dais, for the throne, for the old woman sitting on it with her hands closed on nothing. And the Ashguard, Vor's elite, the best fighters on the plateau, the ones raised to it from childhood, they were positioned along the walls. For the arrest, for the spectacle. Not one of them was between the crowd and the throne. The only thing between the crowd and the throne was Deyan. Here's the part they got right, the recruiters, the one thing in the whole sanded-down legend that's true. He didn't hesitate. There wasn't a heartbeat of it. Vor was still turning. The Ashguard were still peeling off the walls a half-second too slow. The whole court was still catching up to a thing that had already started. And Deyan was already moving, already up the 3 steps of the dais, already turning his body into the space between the gray robes and the queen. He didn't have a weapon out, no time. He just put himself there. The oldest thing a guard does, the only thing in the end that the job actually is. The lance rod fired. I heard it, a sound like the air itself tearing, a flat hard crack that I still hear sometimes. God help me in quiet rooms. And Deyan took it. High in the chest, left side. Where a heart would be on a human. Where his heart was under the rebuilt alloy and the old burn scars. The rod punched into him and the force of it lifted him half off his feet and drove him back against the base of the throne, and he folded down over the queen's knees. And there was blood, human blood, dark red, so shockingly red in that room of pale stone and bluish skin, red splashed across the silver of her robes. Then everything happened at once. The Ashguard hit the man in the gray robes, too late to matter but fast enough to end it, and they weren't gentle, and there was a second crack, and then the gray robes were down on the pale floor and not moving. Humans off the walls, our detachment, all 40 of us moving at once. Vor standing frozen in the center of the floor, papery hands open at his sides, his whole beautiful patient year of work coming apart in front of him because the puppet had just done the one thing a puppet can't do. Olivar shouting for the surgeons. The court, a wall of noise. And the queen. The queen had Deyan folded across her lap, his dark blood on her silver robes, and she was not composed. 68 years of iron and she was not composed at all. She had both her hands pressed to the hole in his chest, those long fingers slick and dark with him, and she had bent all the way down over him, her face against his gray-shot hair, and she was saying something, over and over, low in the old court tongue, the deep one, the one I didn't speak. I asked Olivar, years later, on the night he was dying and telling me everything. I asked him what she'd been saying. He looked at me for a long time. His voice, when it came, wasn't steady either. She was saying his name, Olivar said. His real one, not the one on the station wall, the one from 60 years ago, over and over. As if the old steward stopped. As if calling a body by its true name could keep it from leaving. It's an old belief, a common one, a border belief from the frozen edges. Not a thing a queen would ever be taught. He was quiet a moment. Not a thing a queen would know, he said, unless someone from the frozen edges had once taught it to her, long ago in a bed, while learning to walk again. He didn't die. I'll give you that plainly so you're not carrying it the way I carried it standing against that wall, certain I just watched him go. The rod had gone high and left, through the rebuilt part, through alloy and gel and old scar, and it should have killed a man, and it very nearly killed this man. But whatever the cold out past the reach had done to him once, whatever slows a body past where a body's meant to slow, it hadn't fully let go of him. He was hard to kill. He'd always been hard to kill. He'd been hard to kill for 60 years. They took him to the surgeons, and it was a near thing for 11 days, and I sat outside that medbay for most of them. And on the 11th day he opened his eyes, and the first thing he said, rough as gravel, was to ask if she was all right. Not whether he was, whether she was. That's the whole man, right there. That's the answer to Vor's question and the court's question and the question I'd held onto like a railing that first gray morning. Is he a plant? Is he a weapon? Is he a lie somebody built? A weapon doesn't wake from 11 days at the edge of death and ask, first, before anything, whether the target is safe. His body had answered it already anyway, in front of the whole court. In the one language the Thren have always trusted over every other. Because that's their creed, remember. The one that got us hired in the first place. The mouth can lie. The body cannot. A man can stand in open hall and swear his loyalty with his tongue and be a liar to the bone. But a man who puts his own chest between a lance and the thing he's guarding, with no weapon, no order, no hesitation, half a second before trained soldiers even move, that man's body has said a thing his mouth never could. And every high-blooded house that had spent a year believing their queen was captured by a puppet stood in that hall and watched the puppet bleed red on the throne to keep her breathing. You can't build a regency on that. You can't stand up afterward and say the human was a foreign weapon when the human is lying in the surgeon's rooms with a hole in him that was meant for the queen. Vor understood it before anyone. I watched it happen to his face in real time, same as I'd watched the iron come off the queen's a year before. The whole patient year gone in the length of one lance crack. He made his bow, I'll give him that. He knew how to lose, and he withdrew his petition in light of the warden's proven loyalty. And he left the hall, and within the season he'd taken a posting on the far outer moons, an honorable exile, and I never heard his name again. The man in the gray robes was never identified. His moon disavowed him. Whatever he'd been the front of, it folded back into the cold and the dark and was never seen. Maybe that was the truth of it, and maybe it wasn't. On our wrath, you learn to live without the ends of stories. So that's the part I skipped. That's how the quiet got bought, not with a fairy tale. With a hole in a man's chest and dark blood on silver robes and a queen who forgot, for one whole terrible minute in front of her entire court, how to be composed. After that, nobody could touch them. Not because the court approved, a court like that never approves of anything, but because the court had seen, and what it had seen couldn't be argued with, and so it did the only thing left. It looked away. It let the old servant come to the barracks on quiet nights. It let the guard stand at the foot of the throne with a scar on his chest to match the one at the corner of his mouth. It let the queen never once look down at him on reception days, so total in her not looking that the whole court understood it now for exactly what it was. That's when the 4 years really started. After the blood, once the world had been shown a thing it couldn't unsee and had decided, in its cold machine way, to allow it. I told you at the end of the first part that he stopped saying don't reach back, that he just stopped. I know now why he stopped. It was after the 11 days. It was after he woke and asked if she was safe. Something had reached back through him whether he wanted it or not, had put his body between a lance and the throne before his mind had a vote. And a man can't keep telling himself not to reach back when his own hands have already reached, on their own, faster than thought, for the one thing they were made to guard. He never got his memory. I want to be honest about that to the end. He never woke up one morning knowing his true name, never got the clean scene where it all comes flooding home. Whatever the cold took out past the reach, it kept. He lived the rest of it not knowing for certain what he was. But I don't think he needed to know any more. I think, after the blood, he stopped needing the wall in the dark, because he had the thing the wall was for. He had a hand that knew his burned face by heart, and a name said low in an old tongue over his failing body, and a throne he'd put his own chest in front of without being asked. Proof isn't the same as certainty. He never had the certainty. He had the proof. His body gave it, in the one language that world has always believed. I've thought about that a great deal in the years since. About how the whole galaxy hired us, hired me, hired all of us, because they believed a human body couldn't lie. And how most of us proved them wrong, one way or another, because we were just poor and cold and living inside a story somebody else told about us. And how one of us, one gray old sergeant with no name and no past, stood in a pale hall on a dead cold world and made the story true, made it true with his own chest, told them with his blood on the silver, the one thing the mouth can never quite manage. I am what I look like, I am here, I am yours, I always was. The mouth can lie. His didn't get the chance to. His body spoke first, and it spoke true, and a queen who had not wept in public in 60 years bent down over him with her hands full of his blood and called him by the name the cold had stolen. Whatever else I don't know, and there's so much I'll never know, I know that was true. I was there. I saw it.